So this, like Brian's, is more of an academic paper, and this, like Brian's, starts with a homage to song lyrics. Gay people are all the same. So it's titled "Send in the Clowns. There are giants in the sky." Nobody gets it. This is an old argument or an old story. You've probably heard versions of it before. It's the story of the femininities and masculinities and other gender expressions that didn't get in, didn't get invited, weren't considered, and don't get called masculinity or femininity without other provisos. In many ways, it's the kind of argument that forms the background of possibility for this entire event. An argument about who gets talked about when we talk about sex and desire and attraction, about who is implied and who is marginalized, and whose experiences get to form the lens that we see through. It's not an argument that's unique to me, in other words. And it's not a story that I'm unique in telling. My version of this story is about giants and clowns and the women and men and trans and gender queer and non-identifying folk that they love and that they are loved by. My story begins, as many fairy tales do, with a TLC show. This TLC show is called Strange Sex. I don't know.
I love that show so much.
Oh, good. I've never seen it.
Very problematic, but it's
research. So the show Strange Sex, according to its website, quote, explores mysterious conditions, unusual fetishes, and the kinky science behind sexual attraction. The show exposes individuals willing to develop obstacles, frustrations, and embarrassments that they face as they cope with their sexual conditions. End quote. Conditions. But what, might you ask, does this have to do with gender? It's a good question. What do femininity and masculinity have to do with fetish, have to do with kink? Let's consider this show a little longer and see. Recently, Strange Sex had an episode about macrophilia, which is also sometimes called, usually in its hetero varieties, the giantess fetish. This is, for the uninitiated, a fetish about a giant person, often a woman, and a tiny person, often the size of a bug in comparison. This fetish has two forms. Either one partner is shrunk down while the other remains normal size, or one partner grows to colossal proportions. In the second version, this is often combined with stomping on cities and stomping, lots of stomping, basically. Anyway, I haven't seen the TLC episode on this because research. But I have seen a write-up on the Huffington Post that thrilled at the strangeness of the sex, selecting choice sound bites about the fetishist, named Matt, it's a very kinky name, and his proclivities. Non-fetishist viewers get a juicy thrill of revulsion or amazement at Matt describing his fantasies about being stepped on by a giant woman. They become voyeurs and exoticizers of sexual variety. So you can see the point that I'm building towards. The wrongness of marking out normal, abnormal, staid, and strange, and so on. We have to, in other words, we have to consider the possibility that our kinks are not everyone's kinks. As I said, an old story. But still not a story about masculinity or femininity. Just thinking about fetish in a way other than as abnormal or strange or bizarre helped me think through my femininity, or my masculinity, or all the other aspects of my gender. A thought experiment is useful here. What would happen to your masculinity or your femininity if we were to replace so-called normal sex with another kind of sexual experience? I've mentioned giantess fetishes here, but let me add clown fetishes as another possibility. No particular reason. Basically, I included it because it fills out my Sondheim reference. Obviously, replacing one hierarchy of normal with another hierarchy is really deeply problematic, but for the moment, let's just suppress that concern and let this kind of fantasy play out. So imagine that we replace reproductive heterosexual sex as the normal or default position with something like say, clown fetish or a giantess fetish. What happens to how we talk about attraction or femininity or masculinity? What would it do to our feminisms, our queer theories, our interpretations, our ontologies, our hermeneutics, our epistemologies, our hagiographies, our exegeses, when everything other than clowns becomes featured on TLC as strange sex? This couple, like, you know, you can imagine this couple wants to reproduce. They want to do it in the privacy of their bedroom, 10 out of 10. So imagine how we would think about sex if, as one giantess said in an interview, quote, "It is a fantasy, and it should stay that way," end quote. In other words, giantess porn, being physically impossible, so far, has to be produced either through digital editing or visual tricks like tiny figurines and stuff. It does not, to my knowledge, exist as an in-person practice. So what happens when we don't default to, so what would happen if we didn't default to thinking about sex as something that happened with another person or persons? How does gender function when its main drive, heterosexual differentiation, suddenly breaks down? Imagine how we talk about virginity if normal sex doesn't have a concept of a first time. Does virginity just go away as a thing? Doesn't even the idea of a sexual act become diffuse or disappear? Indeed, my use of the word sex, which I've been sort of using all along, becomes problematic because it implies a certain conceptual framework for thinking about attraction and what we find hot that doesn't work for everybody. I think it would be really interesting to talk about asexuality, although I have nothing in here about that. Now, obviously, this is already something that should have happened in the sense that this idea of creating ways of talking and thinking about sex and attraction that don't presume certain kinds of desire, that don't presume certain kinds of people. But talking about it like this shows how many of our basic, seemingly neutral words come loaded with problems and assumptions and all that. The point, perhaps, is that clown masculinity isn't masculinity with some clown additives. Masculinity is already masculinity with white heteropatriarchy added. Only they don't have to tell you that in the label or show you a picture of what your masculinity looks like on patriarchy. And we're not saying that enough or in the right ways. I suspect that often we continue to reinforce hierarchy through the liberal "of course" gesture. Of course we must consider the position of women, of people of color, of LGBT individuals, of the disabled, of fetish communities, and so on. But it is not within the purview of this paper, this article, this presentation, this film, this study, this novel, this conversation, consider that at length. I think this gesture, a kind of neoliberal get-out-of-jail-free card, if ever there was one, basically allows one to not consider any of these things while remaining seemingly sensitive to them. It allows one to do work and hold conversations and live with a series of assumptions and priorities and hierarchies, while comfortably insulated from the accusation that one is not aware of this. It also means that work that asks for more, or demands more, gets presented as overly present, demanding, self-centered, narcissistic, or critical without being constructive, no matter whether that work asks for consideration, or representation, or just less of our assumptions that desire always necessarily involves certain kinds of things. I say masculinity or femininity, and I expect that you know what I mean. I say that, well, of course we should consider these other things. For now, I just want to talk about femininity. You know, as if it were that simple. As I said, an old story. Now, I don't think we can really replace one normal with another, nor do I think we necessarily should, even if it might open our eyes a little more. Still, it would be nice to not have to send in the clowns. It would be nice. It's all building towards this, people. It would be nice if what Sondheim had already said were true. There is no reason to send in the clowns because they're already here.
Ta-da!